I sat down with David Simas, the CEO of Obama Foundation, for this first talk in our Leadership for the 2030 Agenda talk, where we will discuss with David how value-based leadership was practiced at the White House and how the Obama Foundation is now working with rising leaders all over the world to share their perspectives on value-based leadership. We talked to David about how the polarization and the lack of trust in our societies today are challenging our ability of solving the big challenges that we are facing and how we can move towards a more transformative type of leadership that will actually bring us closer to our goals. You're in for a treat, so I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with David Simas, CEO of the Obama Foundation. Welcome, David. It's such a pleasure to see you. It's an honor and privilege to have you as a guest for this Leadership for the 2030 Agenda talk. Welcome.
Kirsten, what a joy it is to see you again. When I received the invitation for this, I just said yes immediately. I'm such a fan of your work and the way you do your work. So the pleasure is all mine.
Thank you so much. So we've lined up a series of talks where we will focus on what kind of leadership will it take for the world to achieve the global goals, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. And of course, the backdrop could be better. We're off track reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, with COVID, we've seen a massive pushback, and the challenge is now perhaps even greater than it was before. In order to achieve this incredibly ambitious agenda, it's very clear that we need leadership that is able to give us these big transformations. And I couldn't imagine a better person to kick off this conversation with than you, David. And I guess we have to make a disclaimer that I have been part of one of your leadership programs. Yes, and what a joy and honor that was. And therefore, I'm also familiar with the value set that you are working with at the Obama Foundation. And that's what I would like to begin with, David, because you were with President Obama at the White House. And I know that you've shared with me before some anecdotes from the White House about how that value-based leadership was practiced on a day-to-day basis in a very intense environment. And I would love if you could share with our guests today one of those just sneak peeks into what was that like? How did you see that play out in the White House?
On a day-to-day basis, Kirsten, just watching the way that the president and Mrs. Obama engaged, first as human beings, and then secondly, as the leaders of an organization, was so interesting, and the lessons just flowed. The first thing was for the entire team around him. So imagine you're an assistant to the president of the United States or a special assistant, and you're uncertain, you have imposter syndrome, you're honored to serve, but the title is fairly big, and you've never done it before. The leader gives cues. The leader in his or her behavior sets a standard. And it isn't just in the middle of meetings, but for example, I always marveled at how whether the president was meeting in the back of a hotel before he went to speak on a podium with another head of state or was about to see a member of some royal family, his engagement with the dishwasher and the janitor and the person who is cooking the food and the person who is cleaning was the same in terms of the inherent dignity and worth and respect that he showed that individual. And the modeling that gave, the modeling that gave us with our fancy title and our belief of our leadership capacities and capabilities was very, very level setting. And so that I just want to convey was in some ways the most important aspect. And it wasn't out of a playbook. It was a function of who he is and how he acted, whether the cameras are on or the cameras are off. That's the first point. The second point around the approach to leadership is really, I think, predicated on a fundamental understanding of the human condition, good and bad, which is why the pandemic that we're hopefully on the back end of, actually, when you think about the SDGs in the 2030 agenda, yes, we are set back, but what an insight into the different approaches to leadership and the way different groups of people respond in moments of crisis. What can we learn from that? And so one thing that I marveled at, for example, the training day in and day out on the national security side of the White House is all about developing the muscle memory so that when a crisis hits, the normal human reaction of fear, anxiety, us versus them, delusion, the fog and the clouding that's generated from the moment, you've trained to, in some ways, put those aside, Kirsten. And it's almost as if your amygdala is ringing, but you are so conditioned that you can move to your reason. You can move to a more balanced, dispassionate approach that then allows you to bring those values of integrity and inclusivity in a community-oriented approach. And so, you know, the one of the most poignant examples for me was around a decision the president made about Ebola, relevant to what we just went through. And the fear that people were feeling in the United States around Ebola was intense. And the easy political statement that played on fears that people had was shut the borders, shut down all international travel. The science didn't dictate that. The effect on the economy would have been profound. The transmission was profoundly different than what we've seen from COVID. And so rather than engage in that, the president, understanding that he would take the political hit, although it would have been an easy thing to do, tempered it and made sure we're going to do something different. And then the final example that I think it gives you a sense of what a leader can be. The president would often talk about him being in some ways a shock absorber. And the best example was there was a terrorist attack in the United States in California in a city called San Bernardino. And it had indications initially of being tied to international terrorism. And you can imagine on television and the radio and online, immediately the anger and the echoes of 9/11, and some politicians were taking advantage of it. What's the leader's job at that moment? Again, put aside the anger, the fear, the hatred, the fog, and the clouding, and temper the reaction to create a space for your values to come to the top. And this was a consistent approach that the president took. And I think leadership at every level requires both the modeling of how you are as a human being, but also the discipline that comes in the way you approach crisis and decision making.
Thank you for sharing those examples. And I think it really illustrates how value-based leadership is not only practiced at the highest level and in situations where you meet other leaders, it's very much something that has to trickle down and into all the situations that you encounter as a leader. So thank you for sharing that. And I think also what you've just explained speaks into this situation of polarization that we face in many countries, in our democracies that are challenged by low levels of trust and a crisis of legitimacy, and how we can work with our leadership approach to try and bridge that gap of trust. And David, if you would reflect on sort of the lessons learned from your time in the White House with President Obama, and the work that you are now doing with the Obama Foundation and the leadership programs that you run there, what are the qualities and the characteristics of the leadership that that you are trying to both practice and teach your scholars and fellows and the participants in the programs in the Obama Foundation, and why do you think that's so important to create those transformations that we need?
Kirsten, you said the magic word of trust. Trust is the necessary ingredient around any form or level of social cohesion. Without trust, then the part of us that defaults to the anger, the envy, the jealousy, the hatred, the delusion becomes primed. We are triggered into an us versus them dynamic that is part of who we are. Where I have an old boss who is the governor of Massachusetts who said that leaders can lead in one of two ways, and this is an oversimplification, but it speaks to the point. He said you can lead by having people turn to each other or by having them turn on each other. Both ways work, depending upon what your outcomes and your intentions and your motives are. And so in a moment of low trust, even if you're pushing wonderful and important pieces of the SDG 2030 agenda, you can never go into a community of people who don't trust you and say that I know what's good for you. Why would they believe you? Why would they trust you? And so, the other aspect that sometimes pervades in the United States and overseas, it turns into a, well, don't they understand? Or don't they know? Who has ever been persuaded to change their opinion by being told that they are wrong or being demeaned? That is a profound misunderstanding of the way people interact with one another. And so at the essence of what we try to do at the Obama Foundation around leadership is first to begin with a deep exploration of who you are, what your values are, what triggers you, where do you find solace, how do you overcome all of those aspects of your personality, which, Kirsten, you have, I have, and everyone has, that can very easily be triggered. Once I can do that, then I can begin to engage with others in a way that recognizes their dignity, worth, value, and voice. And sometimes we get caught up because it simply means, like, inclusivity simply means, and it's right to assume that, yes, everybody should have a seat at the table. No one is left behind, which is one of, as you know, one of the very important principles around the 2030 agenda. But too often, we don't include people who disagree with us as part of the no one left behind. And so from a values-based perspective that focuses on inclusivity from the perspective of everyone has worth, including those people that I disagree with profoundly, and community orientation, which is not a zero-sum dynamic, especially in democracies, where it's easy to say, okay, I'll just rack up a majority, do what I want to do, where underneath the surface, trust plummets and social cohesion disintegrates. And so it begins with that understanding of trust and the two fundamental values of inclusivity and community orientation that are about both inclusion and bridge building in a way that helps to build the trust towards what we need to do. Kirsten, if we don't do that across the planet, and it looks fundamentally different in every single country based on culture, on religion, on norms, on socioeconomic factors, on history. I don't know another approach, which is why I was so glad to engage with you in this discussion.
Thank you so much, David. And I think you're completely right. And, you know, I have also spent quite some years in politics, and you know, it's very familiar to me what you're saying about you know, turning towards each other or turning against each other. And I really strongly believe that we need to think about how we can really revitalize that role also of the representative democracy, where our elected public servants can re-engage with their communities and have that very, I think what you describe as a very open and curious approach towards what is actually the needs and visions and you know, desires of their communities, and engage with that. I remember President Obama in I can't remember where I saw him say that, but he said that politics is the tail, not the dog. And so that could prompt me to ask you, David, where is this change going to come from? And maybe that's a leading question, but you know, the President and Mrs. Obama could have chosen to work with, you know, anything they would like after leaving the White House, but they chose to focus on rising leaders around the world and how to support them. So David, why is that? And can you share with us what is your experience so far? You know, having worked with leaders around the world, and do you see that change actually taking form?
It was October of 2016, and he called me into the Oval Office. And no matter how many times that happened, you always catch your breath, and you're always a little nervous. Oh my goodness, what does he want to talk about? You walk in, he's sitting behind that desk, the resolute desk that 13 or 14 presidents have used. And on this day, he began to tell me a story about a vision that he had, where he said, imagine if we can find hundreds of thousands of young men and women, because they exist and they are doing work right now everywhere on the planet, and connect them together around a values-based approach to leadership, where in every community where they are embedded, they have something that national leaders and regional leaders do not have: trust, proximity, relationships. And then once we identify them, we can bring them together so they can learn from each other and engage with each other, but always holding to that central ethos. Imagine what the world can look like in 10, 15, 20, 50, 100, 200 years if we begin that work. And so now these are my words, not his. There are a million Barack Obamas and a million Michelle Obamas all over the planet. And so why focus on them? Because if you just focus on one of the SDGs around clean water and sanitation, we know the technology that is required to do that. Why is it not done? Failure of leadership. We know what's required to make sure that education is ubiquitous, what it is to have a good school. We know what's required for climate change. Why don't we have it? A failure of leadership. And so if we focus, we, the Obama Foundation, the President and Mrs. Obama, on this generation of leaders, we approach it from an issue agnostic perspective, but on the values. Because if you can so integrate this idea, even in a polarized world, in a disaggregated media environment that gives every human being on the planet the ability to find his or her reality, then that role of a community leader is more important than ever. And so this is why we focus on leaders, because for me, when I look at the SDGs, there's one missing. There are probably many missing, but the one that I keep on coming to is that an existential threat that we have to the planet is the breakdown of social cohesion, the tearing of, in each country, whether it's the United States or Denmark, our civic fabric is tearing. And the people who can restitch or weave that fabric are the ones who are close and have trust. And the final thing I'll say on this, Kirsten, and forgive me for going on this riff. An authentic, values-based leadership that is centered on inclusivity and community orientation is so essential, because people can see and sense when they're being spun. The as we say in the United States, the BS meter is finely tuned. And so if you have a generation of leaders whose first instinct is not what can I do for my title, my position, my reelection, my ego, my vanity, my pride, me, but leading in a selfless way, even if people disagree with you, I have heard more often than I can even recount, you know what, I disagree with Kirsten, but I think she has good intentions, and I am willing to listen a little bit more. And it's that final piece of the sentence, I am willing to listen a little bit more, that makes all the difference in the world. This is if you tap that, a human rights-based approach, leave no one behind, and then an emphasis on gender equality and empowerment, you can go a long way, which is why more than half of the Obama leaders across the planet are women, no matter what continent we're doing our work.
Thank you so much, David. And actually that leads very well into sort of the wrap up of our conversation, where I'd very much like you, David, to give us a call to action. Our guests here today who are listening in, what would you recommend them to do, whatever level they're on, with regards to creating this transformation and pushing for value-based leadership where they are?
Yeah, two things. First, some internal work, and then the external work. On the internal work, get into the habit of, on a daily basis, questioning your intentions and your motives and your assumptions. We get in the habit as leaders where we assume or presume that what is good for us or our idea, by definition, is the best. Sometimes it is, more often than not, it is not. And so that constant work of assessing your leadership style is important. So please do that. The second piece that flows from that into the external work is, how dare any of us assume that we really know, without engaging with people and listening to them in the communities where they are living, what they believe and why they believe it. It is the height of arrogance to, from on high, go into any community, any place in the world, with whatever basis of experience or education or connections you have, to arrive and say, I am here to help you. No, not yet. Listen, especially to people who disagree with you. Not that you leave your principles behind, not that you leave your values behind. But you know what, at the end of the day, and this may be naive on my part, but I don't think it is. We have so much more in common than we have that tears us apart. Everyone wants to lead a good life. Everyone wants to have clean water and opportunity. Everyone wants to see their children flourish, their parents be healthy, their contentment be action. Everyone wants that. And if you begin with that foundation across a difference on, well, how do I provide the best level of economic opportunity or education? Yes, those are tactics, those are approaches. But until you can anchor around a common humanity, a basic humanism, then we're caught in polarization, in tribal instincts. And so those two things, internal and external, is something I try, fail a lot, but the discipline of constantly trying to do that is important. So that's, I respectfully submit that for consideration, Kirsten.
Thank you, David. And what we're trying to focus all these leadership talks on is moving from polarization to unity and going from inaction to action to accelerate our movement towards the 2030 agenda. So I think questioning your own motives is great advice, and constantly scrutinizing what your own motivation to move forward is, and then finally listen to others and listen to your communities. I think that's terrific advice, David. It has been such a treat talking to you today, David. Thank you so much for taking your time to join our leadership talks for the 2030 agenda. And finally, David, if people want to learn more about the Obama Foundation, where can they go?
They can go to obama.org. And if you see young leaders in your community, no matter where they are, no matter what they are working on, and if these are people who espouse those values, send them our way. And Kirsten, let me just say in conclusion that you asked in one of your questions about what I have seen. And let me just say, when I talk to you and I see your leadership, this is why I'm hopeful. You and your colleagues, and we now have thousands of others throughout the world, make me hopeful for a different approach to leadership. And so thank you for what you do, and more importantly, for how you do it. So Kirsten, thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Wonderful to see you, and thank you for joining us today.
Good, thank you.